Now, she argued that this diagnosis was very dangerous because the characteristics of SDPD were very similar to the characteristics that women displayed when they had been victims of violence. So in other words, she argued that this diagnosis could be used to pathologize female victims of violence. They were suffering because they had a self-defeating personality disorder, not because they've just been abused. But also, it could let the perpetrators of such violence off the hook because presumably they were just doing what these women wanted. The women had a self-defeating personality disorder. The men, or whomever the abusers were simply obliging. So for this reason, she argued it was a dangerous diagnosis and it shouldn't be included. But Spitzer remained adamant. He did not want to get rid of the diagnosis. And when I was at the DSM archives in Washington, D.C., by the way, there are 9 lineal feet of documents there. I'm sifting through a box and I find this little tag which reads SDPD. And I go down and I pull out this document and I find the very meeting in which Robert Spitzer and his team are discussing Paula J. Caplan's argument. And I'm just going to show you a transcript of that minuted meeting here, verbatim, because I think it's quite interesting. It says the following: they, the women, present a narrow-gauged but persuasive argument. Their powerful argument is that it is a political hot potato. The feminist issue is a false one, that this diagnosis could pathologize female victims of violence. Think. Women's arguments seem irrelevant to questions on the table. They are obscuring their own good arguments. The good arguments being that SDPD is a controversial diagnosis, the irrelevant arguments being those posed by Caplan. Benedek. No empirical basis for category, but you're right. Arguments aren't responsive to questions. Rose. We do great disservice by backing off and not acknowledging that this pattern is pathological. So from this, you see they're saying, no, we're going to keep it in the DSM. And they do keep us in the DSM. But in a last-ditch attempt to try and influence them against doing this, Paula J. Caplan launches on the final strategy. I decide to scrutinize thoroughly the very research used to justify including SDPD in the DSM. Let's have a look now at what she found. Firstly, she found only 2 pieces of research, which is a remarkably small amount by anyone's standards. But now let's have a look at what that research constitutes. In the first piece of research, which was conducted by Robert Spitzer, a group of psychiatrists at only one university who all accepted that SDPD existed were shown some old clinical case studies. Caplan pointed out that just because some psychiatrists at one hospital all diagnosed their patients with SDPD was not proof that the disorder actually exists. All it proves, as Caplan said, is that a group of psychiatrists working at the same institution gave the same label, rightly or wrongly, to a given set of behaviors. It proves nothing more than that. But if you think that first piece of research is weak, then just consider the second piece. A questionnaire was sent to a selected number of members of the American Psychiatric Association. This asked them whether the diagnosis SDPD should be included in the DSM. An official report later conducted by the psychologists Cutchins and Kirch showed that only 11% voted yes, which is surely not a representative sample of the psychiatric community. So that is the research basis for including SDPD in the DSM. Now you could say to me, look James, fair enough, but look, surely this is an outlier. You're cherry picking the most extreme example in order to rubbish the whole process. That's what you're doing. The research basis for the others disorders was far more robust. Now, if you were to make that argument, that would be a fair argument to make. So let me deal with it now. And I'm going to deal with it by inviting into the discussion somebody called Dr. Theodore Millen. And by the way, Dr. Theodore Millen was a member of the original task force, so he was privy to everything that went on. In the following quote, this is what he says about the research not only supporting the inclusion of SDPD, but all of the other disorders that went into DSM. This is what he says. There was very little systematic research, and much of the research that existed was really a hodgepodge, scattered, inconsistent, and ambiguous. I think the majority of us recognize that the amount of good, solid science upon which we were making our decisions was pretty modest. So let me now go back to sitting in Robert Spitzer's front room back in Princeton. I decide to read to Robert this quote to see what he made of it. And after a short and a slightly uncomfortable silence, Robert Spitzer responded in a way I simply had not expected. He said the following: "Well, it is certainly true that for many of the disorders that were added, there wasn't a tremendous amount of research. And certainly there wasn't research on the particular way we define these disorders. In the case of Millen's quote, I think he's mainly referring to the personality disorders. But again, it is certainly true that the amount of research validating data on most psychiatric disorders is very limited indeed." So you're saying that there was little research not only supporting your inclusion of new disorders, but also supporting how these disorders should be defined? There are very few disorders whose definition was a result of specific research data. So I was so surprised by this admission that when I returned to the UK some days later, I decided to check it out with other members of his task force. So on a sort of rainy English morning, I decided to call at his office in New York City someone called Professor Donald Klein. Now, Professor Donald Klein is a really important figure in the history of DSM. He was second in command to Robert Spitzer, but actually from the archives, it turns out he probably had, in many areas, almost more influence than Robert Spitzer. So a key player in the history of DSM. I called him and I read to him what Spitzer had said to me to see what he made of it. And this is how he responded. "Sure, we had very little in the way of data, so we were forced to rely on clinical consensus, which, admittedly, is a very poor way to do things. But it was better than anything else we had. So, without data to guide you, how was this consensus reached?" I asked for an example. "We thrashed it out, basically. We had a 3-hour argument. There would be about 12 people sitting down at a table. Usually there was a chairperson and there was somebody taking notes. And at the end of each meeting, there would be a distribution of events. And at the next meeting, some would agree with the inclusion and others would continue arguing. If people were still divided, the matter would be eventually decided by a vote." A vote? Really? Sure, that is how it went. Right, so they're voting here. I'm interested. So the next person I speak to, Dr. Henry Pinsker, again, a member of the original 9, I decide to raise the issue of voting with him. And this is what he said. "Some things were discussed over a number of different meetings, which would sometimes be followed by an exchange of memoranda about it. And then there would simply be a vote. People would raise hands. There weren't that many people." Regarding the legitimacy of this method, Pinsker continued, "We never had any question that that was how we should proceed. I had no reservations at all about working that way." And just to confirm this was the case, when I was in the archives, I managed to source with the archivist 12-minuted task force meetings. And we could only source 12 because that's all we could find. And out of those 12-minuted task force meetings, there is evidence, clear evidence, of votes taking place in 10 of them. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 votes here. Lots and lots of votes on a whole host of different topics. In one of the documents, there was about 24 votes on loads of different things. How to define the disorders, where to set symptom thresholds, whether or not to include the disorders. In other words, the archival evidence absolutely supports what the oral history is saying. Oh, one point I just want to make about all of this. Voting isn't a scientific activity. What is it? It's a cultural activity. When anything is voted into existence, whatever it may be, whether it's a new president of the United States, whether it's a new union leader, whether or not it's a new mental disorder, the likelihood we've got it wrong is never far away.